The Voltari Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, their empire stretching across hundreds of systems, their fleets once unmatched in power. But all that strength, all that history, was now nothing more than fading embers in the face of an unstoppable enemy. The Exelthar swarm had come like a storm, devouring planets, tearing apart warships, and reducing mighty civilizations to ruins. The Voltari had fought, they had resisted, but it was never enough. Their fleets were broken, their soldiers exhausted, and their once proud worlds now lay in ashes. The High Council sat in their war chambers, staring at the grim reports flashing before them, world after world lost, armies annihilated, supply lines cut. There was no hope left, only the slow and inevitable end of their people. And yet, as they faced extinction, an old legend resurfaced, one spoken in whispers, in moments of desperate hope. A story about a species that had survived against all odds, a species that was not the strongest, nor the most advanced, but the most relentless. A species that refused to die, no matter the enemy, no matter the war. Humans. The High Council was divided. Some refused to believe that a mere human could change anything, that calling for help from such a primitive species was anything but madness. Others argued that the legends could not be ignored, that if the Voltari were to perish, they had to at least try everything. The swarm was closing in, and the last Voltari strongholds would not survive another month. With no other choice left, they sent a final message into the void, a desperate plea carried by their fastest ships, encoded with their most urgent distress signal. 3 words, a final gamble that could decide their fate: send us a human. Days passed, then weeks, as the war continued to spiral into disaster. The Exelthar tightened their grip, their warships swarming the last surviving colonies, their monstrous legions overwhelming every defense. The Voltari had no time left. And then, just as hope was about to die completely, a ship arrived. Not a fleet, not a grand armada of warriors, but a single, unremarkable vessel. The council waited in tense silence as the ship's hatch opened, expecting an army, a superweapon, some miracle to justify their final act of desperation. Instead, one man stepped out. He was no towering warrior, no genetically enhanced soldier, no armored conqueror. He was simply a man, clad in a worn flight jacket, carrying nothing but a small bag slung over his shoulder. His face was lined with the scars of past battles, his expression calm, almost amused, as if he had seen worse and had somehow survived. He introduced himself with a name that meant nothing to the Voltari captain Elias Kane. The silence in the chamber was heavy, filled with disbelief, frustration, and growing anger. This was humanity's answer? A single man? The Voltari had been expecting an army, a force capable of turning the tide of war, not this lone figure who stood before them with a smirk, as if he found their desperation amusing. Some of the council members demanded he be sent back, that the humans had mocked them, that it was already over. But Kane simply walked forward, studying the battle maps, looking at the reports of fallen fleets and destroyed cities, and then, in a voice so calm it almost seemed absurd given the situation, he spoke the last words anyone had expected to hear. "You've been fighting them the wrong way." The council erupted in outrage. What did he mean? They had fought with every weapon, every strategy, every ounce of strength they had left. How could one man claim to know better? But Kane was not there to argue. He pointed at the enemy's movement patterns, their formations, their weaknesses that the Voltari had overlooked. He didn't talk about honor, about tradition, about fighting like noble warriors. He talked about survival. Tricks, deception, hitting the enemy where they least expected, striking from the shadows, and never, ever fighting a fair battle. The Voltari had always fought with honor, but honor had not stopped the swarm from tearing their worlds apart. As the council debated, alarms blared across the stronghold. The Exelthar were here. The last surviving Voltari forces scrambled to their stations, ready for what they believed would be their final battle. But before anyone could stop him, Kane moved. He didn't wait for orders, didn't ask for permission. He commandeered a starfighter, examined its controls as if he was testing an unfamiliar tool, and within minutes he was airborne, heading straight for the incoming enemy fleet. The council watched in stunned silence as the human pilot did what no Voltari had ever dared. He attacked first. Not in a grand noble charge, but in a way that defied all reason. He weaved through enemy ships, exploiting blind spots they had never considered, launching precise, devastating strikes at weak points no one had noticed before. He fought like no one else in the galaxy. And in that moment, as explosions filled the sky, as the XL-Thar swarm recoiled for the first time, the Voltari saw something they had not felt in a long, long time. Hope. The Voltari had seen many battles, had witnessed countless warriors rise and fall, had built fleets that once dominated the stars. But as they stood in their war chamber, watching the human known as Captain Elias Kane descend from his ship, they felt something they could not explain. He was not what they expected. Not a towering warrior clad in advanced armor, not an army of soldiers or a fleet of warships, but a single man with sharp eyes and a casual stance, as if he were not standing among desperate rulers of a dying empire, but merely arriving at another job. The High Council had been silent at first, expecting him to speak, to explain, to justify why humanity had answered their plea with just one person. But Kane did not waste time with words. He simply looked at the holographic map of the galaxy, studied the battle reports scattered before him, and then, as if the answer had always been obvious, he told them exactly what they had been doing wrong. The council had been outraged. They were warriors, strategists, rulers of a once mighty civilization. Who was this human to speak to them as if they were children? Yet, as he spoke, as he pointed out their flaws, they could not ignore the truth behind his words. The Voltari had fought with honor, had faced the XL-Thar in open battle, had believed that strength and discipline would be enough. But Kane saw the war differently. He saw it as a game of survival, not of honor. The XL-Thar did not care for noble battles or fair fights. They were a swarm, a relentless force that consumed everything in its path, and Kane knew that the only way to defeat a force like that was to fight like a human. To strike where they least expected. To use deception, misdirection, chaos, everything that the Voltari had never considered. And then, before the council could decide whether to listen to him or throw him out, the alarms rang across the stronghold. The enemy had arrived. The Voltari scrambled to prepare, their forces still weakened, their defenses stretched too thin. It was a sight they had seen too many times before XL-Thar warships darkening the skies, their monstrous soldiers preparing to descend like a tide of death. The Voltari commanders expected Kane to step back, to let the real warriors handle the battle. But instead, he moved with a calmness that unsettled them. Without waiting for approval, he made his way to the starfighter bay, stepping into a Voltari attack craft, as if he had flown one 1,000 times before. The technicians hesitated, unsure whether to stop him, but Kane simply gave them a look that made them step aside, not out of fear, but out of something else. And then, with a roar of engines, he was in the sky. The battle erupted like fire across the heavens, the Voltari struggling to hold the line as the XL-Thar ships swarmed toward them. But Kane did not fight like them. He did not engage in formation, did not follow standard tactics. He moved unpredictably, weaving through enemy ships in ways that seemed impossible, diving straight into the heart of the swarm where no pilot should have survived. The Voltari watched in disbelief as he tore through the enemy ranks with terrifying efficiency. He exploited weaknesses they had never noticed, struck from angles they had never considered, used tricks that no Voltari pilot would have dared. Where others saw an unwinnable battle, he saw opportunities. And the XL-Thar did not know how to fight him. They had adapted to the Voltari, had learned their tactics, had countered their every strategy. But this was different. Kane was chaos itself. He fought without patterns, without hesitation, without fear. He was reckless, diving into swarms of enemy fighters, only to emerge unscathed while leaving trails of destruction behind. He used asteroids as weapons, debris as cover, enemy ships as shields. And for the first time in the war, the XL-Thar hesitated. The Voltari, stunned by what they were seeing, found themselves following his lead. Their pilots, once bound by rigid formations and predictable tactics, began to fight differently. They adapted, learned, became unpredictable. And as the battle raged on, something incredible happened. They started winning. The XL Thar, unable to anticipate the sudden shift in tactics, found themselves struggling. Their warships, which had always crushed the Voltari with overwhelming force, were now being outmaneuvered, outthought, outplayed. One by one, their ships fell, their attack faltered, and then for the first time in decades they retreated. When Kane finally landed, his starfighter scorched and battered but still intact, the war chamber was silent. No one knew what to say. The High Council, once doubtful, once furious, now only stared at him. He had done in a single battle what their entire war machine had failed to do for years. He had made the XL Thar retreat. Kane simply stepped out of the cockpit, stretched as if he had just taken a casual flight, and smirked. Not bad for my first day, huh? The Voltari had seen war for centuries, had fought battles across countless star systems, had watched entire civilizations rise and fall. But never had they seen anything like this. Captain Elias Kane was not like them. He did not fight like them. He did not think like them. And the more they watched him, the more they realized something terrifying. He was enjoying this. While the Voltari had spent years struggling, desperate to survive, Kane moved through the battlefield as if he were playing a game where the rules only applied to everyone else. He fought with no hesitation, no fear, no respect for the enemy's overwhelming numbers. The XL Thar swarm was supposed to be an unstoppable force, a wave of destruction that consumed everything in its path. But Kane treated them as just another problem to solve. And he was solving it in ways that made no sense. At first, the Voltari pilots had thought his victories were luck, a fluke, the result of an unpredictable enemy not knowing how to counter an unknown variable. But battle after battle, Kane proved otherwise. He did not just win, humiliated the XL Thar. He used bait tactics no Voltari would have dared, faking retreat, only to lure entire enemy squadrons into explosive traps. He turned space debris into weapons, hiding mines within shattered ships, so the XL Thar would unknowingly fly into their own destruction. He hacked into enemy communications, sending false orders that made their fleets turn against each other. He even bluffed an enemy warlord into surrendering by pretending to have a doomsday weapon he didn't actually possess. And somehow, it all worked. The Voltari soldiers were in awe, but they were also afraid. This was not how war was supposed to be fought. War was strategy, discipline, sacrifice. But to Kane, it was an art of deception, of manipulation, of bending the universe itself to his will. The XL Thar were not just fighting a human, they were fighting a mind that refused to accept limits, a man who saw every rule, every tradition, every certainty as something to be broken. And that was what made him so dangerous. He was not the strongest. He was not the fastest. But he was the most unpredictable being they had ever encountered. The High Council watched his growing influence with unease. The Voltari had started changing. Their pilots, their soldiers, even their commanders had begun to think differently. They were adapting, learning from Kane, using tactics they once considered dishonorable or foolish. They were becoming less like Voltari and more like humans. And that terrified the Council. War was supposed to be fought with honor, with order. Yet, every time they questioned Kane's methods, he had already won another battle. And the enemy? The XL Thar were no longer advancing. They were stalling, hesitating, retreating. The swarm, once an unstoppable force, was now on the defensive. And that was when Kane did something truly insane. He stopped waiting for the enemy to attack. Instead of holding the line, instead of preparing for another defensive battle, he took the war straight to the swarm's home territory. The Voltari commanders had thought he was joking at first. No one attacked the XL Thar in their own systems. It was suicide. Even at their strongest, the Voltari had never dared to enter those dark sectors of space where the swarm had complete control. But Kane was already preparing a strike team. He had studied the XL Thar, learned how they thought, how they reacted. And he had found a weakness. Their entire war machine relied on a central intelligence, a massive, living construct known as the Nexus Mind. The swarm was powerful, but it was not an empire. It did not have individual leaders. Instead, it was controlled by a single, massive biocomputer that issued orders across the entire fleet. If Kane could reach it, if he could disrupt it, the entire swarm would collapse into chaos. No one had ever considered attacking the Nexus mine before. It was suicide. A fleet could not break through the swarm's defenses. Even the strongest Volteri warships had fallen trying to reach it. But Kane did not plan to use a fleet. He planned to use stealth, deception, and pure madness. He took a stolen Exelthar warship, disguised it using the wreckage of fallen Voltari vessels, and infiltrated enemy space with only a handful of soldiers. The journey was a nightmare. Seldar patrols swarmed the dark void, hunting for intruders. The warship's stolen identity barely held, and every moment was a breath away from exposure. But Kane was not just a pilot, he was a tactician who saw every situation as a puzzle waiting to be solved. He bluffed his way past enemy checkpoints, using distorted Exelthar transmissions to fake clearance codes. He sabotaged an enemy outpost, making it appear as if an internal rebellion was unfolding. He even rewired an abandoned Volteri distress beacon to send false emergency signals, drawing Exelthar fleets away from their main defenses. Every step, every action, was on the edge of disaster. And then against all odds, they reached the Nexus mine. The construct was unlike anything the Volteri had imagined. A living machine pulsing with organic tendrils and glowing veins of bioenergy, a structure that thought, that commanded, that controlled an entire race with its will. To destroy it meant destroying the brain of the enemy, but there was no time for caution. The Exelthar had discovered the infiltration. The swarm was closing in. Kane had one chance. Instead of planting explosives, instead of launching a conventional attack, he hacked into the Nexus mine itself. He flooded its systems with corrupted data, using stolen Exelthar technology against them. He fed it false battle reports, making it believe that the swarm was under attack from an overwhelming force. He turned its own intelligence against it, triggering a self-destructive cycle of confusion, miscommunication, and panic. Within moments, the Exelthar fleets across the sector began turning on each other, attacking phantom enemies that did not exist. The swarm was eating itself alive. AS alarms screamed through the Nexus mine's core. Kane and his team barely escaped. Their stolen warship blasted out of the system just as the swarm's entire network collapsed into chaos. The once unified force became a scattered mess of broken fleets, leaderless soldiers, and infighting warlords. And just like that, the tide of the war had turned. When Kane returned, the Voltari were silent. Their greatest enemy, the force that had nearly wiped them from existence, was now on the brink of destruction. And it had not been done by fleets or armies or superweapons. It had been done by one human, a handful of soldiers, and a mind that refused to play by the rules. The High Council no longer doubted Kane's methods. They no longer questioned his madness. Because in the end, his madness was exactly what had saved them. The war was not over. The Exelthar swarm, once an unstoppable force, was now fractured, weakened, confused. Their Nexus mind, the intelligence that controlled them, had been crippled by Kane's insane strategy. Across the galaxy, the swarm's fleets turned against each other, fighting battles against enemies that did not exist, driven mad by false data Kane had implanted. The Voltari had seen the impossible happen, their greatest enemy stumbling, retreating, breaking apart. But Kane was not celebrating. He knew something the others did not. The Exelthar were wounded, but they were not dead. Somewhere, deep within their territory, the Nexus mind was trying to repair itself. It was learning, adapting, evolving. The Exelthar were not a race like the Volteri or humanity. They were a living weapon, designed for one purpose: to consume and destroy. And Kane had made them do something they had never done before: lose. The swarm had no concept of failure, no understanding of defeat. But now, for the first time in their existence, they had been outplayed. And they would not let it happen again. Kane knew they had one last chance. If the Exelthar recovered, if they adapted to his tactics, then the war would continue, and this time, there would be no second opportunity. The swarm would return, stronger, faster, more ruthless than before. The only way to win was to end it now. And that meant doing the unthinkable. They had to strike at the heart of the enemy. The Volturi High Council hesitated. They had fought for survival for so long that the idea of going on the offensive was almost impossible to comprehend. But Cain had already made his decision. He had studied the Exelthar, had analyzed their every move. He knew their weakness, the one thing that no one had ever dared to exploit. The Exelthar were not just a swarm of mindless creatures. They had a source, a beginning. And Cain knew where it was, that in the depths of space, beyond the reaches of known star maps, lay a dark, forbidden world. A planet unlike any other, hidden beneath layers of blackened nebulae, protected by ancient defenses that no fleet had ever breached. It was the birthplace of the Exelthar, the source of the swarm. If they could destroy it, they could end the war forever. But no fleet could make the journey. No army could break through. It had to be a small team, a suicide mission. And Cain was the first to volunteer. With only a handful of Volturi soldiers, a stolen Exelthar warship, and a plan so insane that it had to work, Cain led the final strike. The journey was a nightmare, a graveyard of ships, the remains of countless civilizations that had tried and failed to reach the dark planet. The Exelthar had not been created naturally. They were a weapon built by something ancient, something that had long since disappeared but had left behind a horror that refused to die. When Cain's team reached the surface, they found the truth. The Exelthar were not just a swarm. They were growing. Beneath the surface of the planet, deep within endless tunnels of pulsating organic metal, they found something worse than an army. The swarm had a core. A single, massive gestalt intelligence, a hive mind that was already rebuilding itself. The Nexus mind had been only a fraction of the true threat. And it was awake. Cain had minutes, maybe less. The swarm was coming. The tunnels shook as millions of Exelthar drones poured from the shadows, their screeches vibrating through the air. The ground pulsed like a living thing, tendrils of dark energy reaching out, trying to consume them. There was only one way to end it. They had to destroy the planet. The Volturi engineers worked frantically, setting up explosives, overloading the ship's core, turning their stolen vessel into a bomb. But it was not enough. The swarm was too fast. The moment they realized what Cain was doing, they threw everything at him. The tunnels became a battleground, a nightmare of claws and fire, as the team fought their way back to the surface. The mission had turned into a last stand. Cain was the last one standing. His soldiers were down. His weapons were nearly empty. The ship's self-destruct had been triggered, but it needed manual activation to ensure total destruction. The others begged him to leave, to find another way. But Cain knew there was no other way. The swarm was already learning from him. If they survived this, they would return stronger, smarter. There could be no escape. With one last breath, Cain did the impossible. He hacked the swarm itself. Using stolen Exelthar technology, he sent one final command directly into the hive mind. A message that was not words, not threats, but a challenge. A concept they had never understood before. A human concept. Checkmate. And then he activated the final trigger. The ship detonated, a chain reaction of explosions ripping through the planet's core. The swarm screamed. The tunnels collapsed. The skies burned. And then silence. The war was over. The Volturi watched from orbit as the impossible happened. The heart of the swarm, the source of their endless war, was gone. Cain had done it. One human against an entire race. And he had won. But he had not returned. The High Council stood in silence, watching the ruins of the enemy burn in the void. They had feared Cain's madness. They had questioned his methods. But in the end, his madness had saved them. And so, for the first time in their history, the Volturi spoke the name of a human, not with doubt or hesitation, but with reverence. Elias Cain, the human who changed the war. But the question remained, was he truly gone? Because somewhere, deep in the remains of the shattered world, a signal flickered. A human signal. The war was over. The Excelthar swarm, once an unstoppable force, was now nothing more than ruins drifting through space. The dark planet, the heart of their endless hunger, had been obliterated. The Voltari had achieved what they once thought impossible. For the first time in centuries, their people were no longer on the brink of extinction. They had survived. But at what cost? Elias Kane was gone. The Voltari fleet searched for him for days, then weeks. Scanners combed through the debris, searching for any trace of the man who had saved them. There was nothing. No distress beacon. No escape pod. No body. The last thing anyone had seen was the planet breaking apart beneath a wave of fire, with Kane at its heart. The High Council officially declared him lost in battle, his name etched into the archives as the human who had defied an empire and won. Statues were built. Songs were written. Across the stars, his name was whispered with both awe and fear. But the Volturi could not forget, because something was wrong. There were rumors. Fleets patrolling the edges of space reported strange signals, flickering messages that made no sense, codes that matched old human military transmissions. A deep space outpost detected anomalous energy readings near the site of the destroyed planet, as if something had survived the blast. And then there were the stories. A Excelthar warship, one of the last surviving remnants of the swarm, had been found drifting in the void. Its crew, if the Excelthar could even be called, that had been ripped apart from the inside. Weapon systems had been sabotaged, their communications destroyed. The ship's data logs held only a single transmission, written in a language the Voltari should not have been able to read. But they could, because it was written in human English. "I am still here." The High Council did not know what to make of it. The message should have been impossible. Kane had died. There was no way he could have survived a planetary explosion, no way he could have lived without support, without an army, without even a ship. And yet, the signs continued. A Voltari merchant fleet traveling through uncharted space reported a lone figure on a ruined world, watching them from the shadows before disappearing. A pirate stronghold, known for preying on war refugees, was found completely wiped out, their defenses disabled in a way only one man had ever done before. And then the final proof arrived. A Voltari scout ship, investigating the remains of a destroyed Excelthar outpost, picked up a signal, a human distress beacon. It was old, the kind used by Earth's military before their fleet had fallen. It should not have been functioning, but it was. And it contained a single phrase. The war is not over. The Voltari could no longer ignore the truth. Elias Kane was alive. But he was not the same. Whatever had happened in those final moments, whatever had allowed him to survive, had changed him. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a man who had fought an impossible war. He had become something else. A legend. A ghost. A force moving through the stars, striking from the darkness, ensuring that the Excelthar, or anything like them, never returned. The High Council debated what to do. Should they search for him? Should they bring him back? But the truth was, Kane was never coming back. He had chosen his path. He had gone beyond the war, beyond the limits of what a single human should have been capable of. The Volturi realized the truth too late. Kane had never fought for medals. He had never fought for power or for glory. He had fought because it was the only thing he knew how to do. And now, even after the war had ended, he was still fighting. His name became a warning. Across the galaxy, those who sought to conquer, to destroy, to spread war and chaos, they feared the shadow of the human who had defied a swarm. Pirates whispered his name like a curse. Warlords avoided the paths where he had been seen, because no one knew when or where he would strike. But when he did, it was already too late. The Voltari no longer searched for Elias Kane. They no longer tried to bring him back. Because deep down, they understood. He was no longer just a human. He was a legend, and legends never die.